Hi Roman vacationers, we are back again for another Tiny Tour Tuesday. This one is number 11 and we are at the Palatine Hill. Without further ado, we're going to let Mircea take it away and show you guys the Palatine Hill here in Rome.
Hello everybody. So as my colleague said, I'm Mircea. I'm back at the Roman Tiny Tour, Roman Vacations. We're now on top of the Palatine Hill, the famous historical birth site of Rome. This is where Romulus and Remus had their famous encounter with the she-wolf. This is where they were raised as children, and this is where Angela is going to help me with the rotating device. Now, what happens is that as the ages, guys, the city of Rome is born on a legend. It's born on Romulus and Remus. However, the Romans themselves are born on the back of many sacrifices and many great minds and people. The city started on top of this hill in the middle of a swamp created by the Tiber, but with the time, the people settled here so they can control the island, which would be behind me at this point. And as any city, you're going to have an economical incentive, and that would be the passage over the island towards the city of Naples and the Greek colonies. With the ages, guys, the Romans are going to start growing their city, and whoever lives in the center is the richer guy, whoever lives in the outskirts, well, the newer guy. The Romans called them patricians and plebeians, then in the Republic, the senators, and the rest of the Romans would have been on the other hills. Now, as the ages go, guys, you're going to end up with the Roman senators having their villas on top of this hill. And then at the end of the Republic in 27 before Christ, the first emperor of Rome, Octavian Augustus, Caesar's nephew, will take over. He's going to build his house somewhere behind me to that side of the hill and start a snowball effect that every single emperor afterwards is going to enlarge upon. We're now leaving the throne chamber built somewhere at the end of the 1st century during the reign of the Emperor Domitian Flavius. This is the youngest son of Vespasian Flavius, the man that built the Colosseum. The throne chamber, now called the Aula Regia, is basically where you could petition the emperor, but also where you could have chiefs of staff, politicians, kind of the same regulars that would meet your president today would get to meet an emperor as well. Now, in Roman times, and I'm pretty sure you're all familiar with the structure, one of the most famous structures in a Roman house would be the peristilum. Every single TV show and movie you've seen, usually the talking is done either in a campaign tent, because they're Roman, or in a inside courtyard in their house. You can see the sky, you can see the rooms, there's columns everywhere, and usually a tiny pool. Well, if you're an emperor, you need to have a peristilum the size of your average Joe's house. You need to have about 4 of them, and everything needs to be imported. So once we leave the throne chamber through that gate, we would actually end up in an outside courtyard behind me. So simply imagine a colonnade with the fountain in the middle open to the sky. So right above my head I would have a canopy, but that canopy roughly around that place would end up with a column here, and so on everywhere, right? So this is one peristilum. The palace will end up having quite a few of them as the age goes. Follow me this way. So now, over the ages, many famed heads lived on the Palatine. So you had the first emperor Augustus, then you had the man that builds most of the structures around the Emperor Domitian Flavius. Even the infamous Commodus lived here, and he loved one of the things I'll show you at the end. And because the emperors lived here, well, in his supreme arrogance, Mussolini wanted to live here in the 1930s. So the house that I'm about to show you now is a house that was used heavily by the fascist protocol department, mainly for visitors, high-ranking heads of the fascist times. So think of Mussolini, his heads of the government. You're going to look at visitors like Hitler, Franco, during the war, generals like Rommel, Guderian, and so on. They're all going to hang out in the house over here. Now, the house itself, it's been closed for a while due to the fact that it's mainly made with asbestos and bad plumbing, but you can see on top you still have the fascist eagle, and underneath of it there's a line that says Benito Mussolini Imperatore. Luckily the building at this point is placed in its deserved place, and it's used mainly as a modern day toilet. So now, follow me this way. It's part of the museum, but it's been closed due to plumbing issues. Now, the trick with peristilos, right? So if you remember from most TV shows and movies where you see this inside courtyard, usually you have a chamber at one end and a chamber at the other end. In between the two of them, you have the courtyard. Now, symmetry would be the object here. So if you have the throne chamber behind us where we're coming from, then a courtyard in the middle. Well, at the other end, you'll have this. Another chamber which is right behind me. You see it through the wall. This would be one end of the peristylium, another end would be the throne chamber, and behind me you have the dining hall, the cenarium. This would have actually had a floor that was straight, but it would have been 3 feet or a meter above ground, and that's where you'd push a steam column, and you'd have under the floor heating. It's called the hypocaust. It's a fancy Greek word. Hypo means under, caust means warm. But imagine that in effect you would have to have a chamber below the dining chamber, where you have bronze cauldrons with a team of slaves filling them up with water, sending the steam through the floor, heating up the floor, and then another team of engineers and slaves on the other side of the wall where I am now, diverting the steam columns, just like from a kettle to different parts of the palace. So just imagine the arrogance of having about 50 slaves and 4 trained engineers risking their lives of getting steam burned so you can have warm tootsies. And that's basically the Roman Emperor. Now, much of the marble here was scavenged because by the 1500s, the papacy is in dire need of building materials and most of the noble families of Rome. A church will be built on top of the hill in the same period, the Church of St. Sebastian. And at that point, the Barberini family, responsible for building the Church of St. Sebastian, took advantage of the fact that nobody's really looking and started taking the marble, the columns, and all the material of worth. That's why you see the palace as a ruin, as a brick ruin, pretty much stripped. Remember, in Roman times, if you're a rich guy, you need a peristylium or 2. My colleague will now show you another one. Right behind us and a floor below, you have another imperial courtyard.
You see it?
Okay. Now that one would lead you from the stables to the actual outside of the palace. So again, imagine kind of a mastering courtyard where you're going to end up with the emperor's horses being brought out, the man saddling them and walking out that way. Now, we're going into the Domus Augustana, the house of the emperors proper. So many of these chambers would have been chambers very familiar to the man on top. Now you'd have the Loggia Mattei and the Aula Isaica. It's a place we're going to go through that would double up more or less as a living room nowadays. But if you guys look to the top, you'll notice that the floor is very, very high up. The ceiling is very high up. Brick, if you guys notice, everywhere we're going, guys, the brick itself seems to be very, very thin. So the reason for that is Roman kilns were not strong enough. They weren't hot enough to actually make a thick brick. So notice how thin they are, right? And that's where you're going to have these square holes. The reason for that is when you build the scaffolding, you embed it in the wall. So when you take the scaffold out, you leave them out so you can come back and revisit it with fresh scaffold. And in that way, you can revisit a wall that tends to break. So wherever you see these square holes at intervals, theoretically, that should be a Roman wall. And the last part, the last thing I want to show you, how do the emperors have fun? This is the nation that builds the Colosseum, right? Up to 70,000 people screaming their lungs out for people fighting with swords. It's also the nation that builds the Circus Maximus. You're looking at about 200,000 people. And by the way, that's just next door to the Palatine. These guys are there to just watch one thing, people going in a circle. If anyone says that's not bad, McLaren. However, if you're going to be that much of a sports fan, the Emperor Domitian, he's the son of the man that built the Colosseum, the Emperor Vespasian. So he's really into sports. So he's going to build an indoor stadium for the best of the best gladiators to perform for him, to perform for his entourage, and to perform for those that he wants to impress. And because it's Roman times and the measure of wealth is usually the number of inside courtyards, of course you're going to stick the stadium into a peristylium. And voila. Let's see if we can flip it. There you go. Now guys, down below here, you're going to see on the right-hand side of it a giant arena for an inside area. And that's where you're going to have the best gladiators fighting from the Colosseum. You're going to have shows brought in after hours, after the spectacle inside. And notice the colonnade that goes around. That would have lifted to a balcony to our height, extended about 4 meters or about 12 feet or so outside, and you would have had hanging plants over the walls. They have found traces of lead pipes in the walls, which points out you would have definitely had an irrigation system. Another thing that I wanted to point out was the fact that the columns were made out of brick, if you notice, and covered in marble. It's not that the palace cannot afford marble columns. It's that if you have running water, over the columns, what's going to happen is marble tends to break in one go. Water hits marble, marble tends to go down the crack. If you make the columns, however, in brick and then cover them with marble, you get to tell when the column starts breaking slowly. So a palace engineer would have more warning about the defects due to the water flowing on the side. This is something you'd find a lot in Roman terme, in Roman bathhouses. And with that said, this is Mircea signing off. It's been a pleasure to have you on board for this one. Thanks, and have a very, very good day, guys.
So thank you again for tuning in, and we will see you in 2 weeks for another tiny tour. Bye!
Where did we go?